Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go, Washington Policy's Center podcast of news, interviews, and policy analysis.
Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. This is David Bose, Communications Director for Washington Policy Center. And sitting with me is Liv Finne, our Director for our Center for Education. Liv, all eyes are on 2020. I feel like even though it's 2019, there's been there's been such a focus on 2020. I feel like we're already in the midst of things, and it looks like charter schools are shaping up to be a key issue for the 2020 presidential election. And the New York Times has a new piece that caught your attention because it kind of shows the power struggle right now within the Democrat Party and how they're trying to deal with charter schools. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting development. There's an article that was published just before Thanksgiving last week in the New York Times called "Minority Voters Chafe as Democratic Candidates Abandon Charter Schools," written by Erica Green and Eliza Shapiro. And the subtitle of it is, "The front runners for the presidential nomination are moving away from the charter school movement, and Black and Latino families ask why their concerns are lost." And this encapsulates the reason why I was interested in it, because the leading contenders for the Democratic nomination are pulling away from charter schools, as this article recounts, even though previous Democratic administrations like President Obama's and Clinton strongly supported charter schools. But now that there's this anxiety about getting reelected, getting a Democratic president elected in 2020, they are casting about for which voting bloc is the most powerful and most significant for re-election. And unfortunately, it looks like some candidates are aligning with the union because the union now has made it very clear that they hate charter schools. They don't want any families to have access to a charter school because it's a competing system of schools within the public school system that the unions fear, because teachers are not forced, not compelled to be members of unions in charter schools. So what I thought was significant was that the New York Times now is writing and recording the voices of the Black and Latino families who say that they want to send their children to charter schools, which I follow this very closely. The New York Times has not done this so far. This is the first time I've seen this happen, which is an interesting development.
Yeah, and for people who don't follow politics that closely, Black families make up a considerable portion of the Democrat primary voter. So it's interesting to see the strange disconnect between the primary voters that are going to decide what happens in 2020 and the front runners who are moving away from charter schools because, as you point out, or at least it appears to be because,
yes,
one of the more prominent organizations that delivers in terms of manpower and money to campaigns is saying we don't like those things, whereas some of the other candidates on the lower rung of polls right now are still supporting charter schools, but it seems to be becoming more and more of a direct partisan split, which is a real shame when it comes to the policy regarding charter schools.
Well, we'll see what happens. I think I am eternally optimistic. The fact that the New York Times has come out now willing to record statements like this in the piece. Here's a single mom who she says she has 2 jobs and 5 hustles. Sonia Tyler, she says, I'm just feeling kind of desperate. She plans to enroll her children in a charter school slated to open next fall in the suburb of Atlanta. She says her children are brilliant, they're curious, it's not fair. Why shouldn't I have a choice? And this is significant because the New York Times is saying that a large constituency that traditionally with the Democratic Party is disaffected with what the leading candidates are proposing. This signals some fear about the loss of those voters. And this is based on, you'll recall, Dave, back in the fall, it was reported in the Wall Street Journal that I think it was 100,000 black mothers switched their votes in Florida from the Democratic Party to support Republican candidate for governor DeSantis, because he came out as a strong supporter of school choice and expanding school choice options for minority families. So I think the jury's out on this. I think this is the primary season. People are talking about what the issues are, and the fact that the New York Times, which has become very political, recently, is coming out now and speaking on letting the voices of the families affected by closing charter schools, which is what some of the candidates wish, is a positive development. We'll see what happens.
One of the exciting aspects of this piece from a policy perspective is the role of citizens and citizen activists that are, their focus is drawing attention to this policy. They're trying to get as many candidates as possible. It doesn't come from a perspective of, supporters of one candidate saying we want attention for our candidate. This was citizens that have students in, their children are in these charter schools. They appreciate the choice that charters bring to them, and they're hearing that these choices could be shut down, the educational opportunity shut down, and they just banded together and said, we want attention in general for charter schools, and we want people to know that this is a policy that helps us. There's kind of a message there, I think, for other parents out there who either have kids in the system or wish, because we have waiting lines in Washington State, right?
Yes, we have waiting lists of families who want to send their kid to a charter school and can't get into one, which it's interesting because most of the charter schools that we have in Washington State, there are 9 of them right now, are opened in inner city urban areas where the families have never had a choice of where to send their kid to school. They are assigned to the school down the block, whether or not that school is a good school. And many families recognize, and these are low-income families that cannot buy a home in Bellevue or north of the Ship Canal in Seattle. They don't have any choices, and they hear that there's going to be a better charter school opening down the street, and they want to send their kid to the better school naturally. It's just natural. And for powerful special interests to block their opportunities, it's a disgrace, especially when it comes to the education of children. There's another quote in this article and this is a real shift. Now we're getting quotes from the leaders of charter schools in the New York Times. We never had quotes from them before. Okay, we always had quotes from union officials, powerful officials trying to stop the growth of charter schools. Now we're hearing from, for example, in this New York Times piece, Ricardo Morales, the founder of the Academia Advanced Charter School in Los Angeles. He said his predominantly Latino students could not wait for school districts to fix their problems. He says, quote, "If we wait around for them to address these things, we're writing off years, if not generations of kids," Mr. Morales said. That is precisely right. You're always being told, oh, well, the schools need more money. If we get more money to the schools, they will be improved. This is the promise that has been made. I've heard it for 40 years, and it never happens. And so different models of public education, like charter schools, are exciting people that want to see better quality education, public education.
Yeah, and that attitude of, hey, well, everybody should just wait for change, especially when you're dealing with kids where 1 year is an entire grade gone,
Exactly.
right? And that's a year of learning that they either get it or they didn't.
Exactly.
Childhood only lasts for so long. It doesn't wait for policy implementation.
Yes.
We don't like to wait when there's bad cell phone service. We just make a switch to a different provider.
Well, that is such a good point. The public school monopoly relies on the fact that the parents that are coming are growing out of the system. So they temporize. I looked this word up when I knew that they were playing games with me when they were saying, oh, just wait till next year, it will be better next year. My kid was a certain age. He needed to get reading taught to him in a good way, or math taught to him in an effective way. We couldn't wait for next year until next year. By next year, he could be disaffected by the whole effort,
Sure.
in education in schools. You lose children overnight. So It is very important to take care of the problem now. To be told that 1 year someday in the future, when your child is long gone from public schools, that they're going to be better it could be generously called an exercise in magical thinking, but I think it's a cynical ploy to delay and not meet the demands and needs of the customers right there before you. It's just.
Now, there was one additional argument that they brought forward, critics of charter schools, in the Times piece, and I've heard it a dozen times, but I thought we should address it.
Yes.
And that was that charter schools are taking all of the best students, and they're leaving the traditional public schools with the most challenging students, and they're kind of framing it as though charter schools kind of take the cream of the crop and have this advantage over the traditional public schools, and it just makes the public school system struggle all the more. You know which section of the story I'm talking about. What was your response to that argument?
Well, that is the central planner's argument, that we must keep everyone stuck in a sinking ship together because we're going to only provide a certain low quality of services available, and we're not going to let anyone out. We're not going to, and actually, that's actually an answer. Someone in this article answered that exact question. Tariq Abdullah and his wife were planning to open a charter school in the Atlanta suburbs next year, in part so their son can go to a school close to home without attending a failing school. He says this, Mr. Abdullah: "We look at it as a burning ship going down with thousands of kids in it, and we're trying to get kids on lifeboats." So that argument that kids should not be allowed to leave because they're going to leave the people behind in a worse situation is just a dismissal of all the children. In fact, the empirical data show that if you let the children select out to go to a charter school, then the remaining traditional schools see the children leaving and the money going with them, and they improve their programs, which of course is what happens in the private sector all the time. Competition, pressure to improve only comes when a system is forced to face and meet the needs of the customers before them. And the monopoly schools don't have that pressure. They have a guaranteed income stream. That is the basic flaw of our public education system, is that the existing system of schools is guaranteed to get the same money, more money every year. Mm-hmm. And therefore, they have no incentive to improve. They have no incentive to teach a reading instruction method that actually works. I have been discussing this on Twitter with a father who had been taught the failed look-say method of learning reading in the Renton schools back in the 1960s. Then his children came along, and they were still being taught the same failed whole language, just called a different name. They have the science of education and learning all shows that deep instruction in phonics, a structured, rigorous program to teach children how to decode words. That is the way to teach children how to learn well, and the schools do not teach it. And why is it? Because they have no feedback loop of correction. There's nobody able to leave. So that's why public charter schools, any kind of choice program, is beneficial for the kids that are left behind, as well as for the children that leave, because you introduce competition and you will introduce improvements by virtue of that competition.
Yeah, it's funny. Without competition, you really don't know what you're capable of, because most of the time you'll ask any business, hey, is it possible to do this? And people will say no, but then a new competitor arises, and all of a sudden they find new ways to deliver the same product for less, or
That's
better
a great
product
point.
for less.
That's
it's
a great point.
Yeah.
I recall when I had my children in public schools in Los Angeles, I could choose 2 schools in the neighborhood. And we parents were trying to get our local principal to allow us to just, as our children moved from kindergarten to first grade, to just express our desire for a particular teacher. The principal said, "Oh, we can't possibly allow you to say that. We're the ones who are going to decide which teacher your kid will get, regardless of their personalities, their strengths, or whatever, weaknesses of the teacher and of the child, So then the school across the town where we could all transfer to turned into a charter school. And the first thing they did was to allow parents to express a preference for the next grade teachers. And lo and behold, what happened?
Worked out just fine, didn't it?
It worked. All of a sudden, the school that we were in changed its policy and allowed us to express our opinions about where our child should be assigned to and turn next year's class. So that sort of thing happens, in many ways, in multiple ways, if you allow parents to leave a particular school. and a vote of no confidence in that leadership.
This sounds like the school had to focus less on pleasing people internally and the system,
Yes.
and focus on pleasing their actual customers, which
Yes.
are the taxpayers, the parents, and the children, most importantly.
Yeah.
You've alluded to this a couple of times now, and that's money. Money in
Yes.
education's been a big deal.
Yes.
I know that you have done a lot of research on the amount of money going to local districts. In fact, the last time there was statewide strikes that were brought up last year,
Yes.
you pointed out how much money was going into individual school districts. Now, I know you've been doing some follow-up work on just how much Washington State has increased per pupil funding and what that's meant to educational achievement. Can you give us a sneak peek at what you're learning?
Yes. Well, I have been following the increase in public education spending for the last 12 years. And as most people that follow it know, the schools have decided to, the state legislature has decided that the one policy to improve the schools is to increase funding for the schools. It all makes everybody look good if they do that. So I have data from official government sources showing that starting in 2011-13, the state was funding schools at $13.5 billion, and now in 2019-21, in the current state budget, that the state is providing $27.3 billion to the schools. That's double the amount that they provided 6 years ago, double the amount the state has provided. And this, if you put it in per student terms, it's an increase from $10,000 per student 6 years ago to $16,000 per student on average across the state. So that's a $6,000 per student increase. So if you just multiply that across, a classroom, you're well into $400,000 per classroom, and teachers cost about $110,000 now. Teachers are getting on average about $83,000 in pay, plus another $30,000 in benefits. They're getting well paid in Washington State. If you just subtract that cost from the $400,000 they're getting in revenue, you start to wonder, where's all that other money going? And it just proves the premise that more funding does not translate into better schools, because the student test scores are no better. We've had multiple years now of reports on student academic performance on the state tests in reading, math, and science, and we have national tests, the NAEP tests that the federal government administers, and in the most recent administration, 2019, we've actually seen test scores drop in reading in both 4th and 8th grade, and math. So in Washington State, we have doubled state spending on the schools, yet students are not learning any better. High school graduation rates are being artificially inflated by the state, and we have the same monopoly system developing mediocre results. And it's a wonder that people put up with it, but once they learn how much money is actually in the schools, that's why it's worth repeating. Now, on average, the state is providing total funding from all state, local, and federal sources, $16,000 per student. For that, every student should be able to graduate, every student should be able to pass state tests, yet only about a third are proficient in reading and writing in Washington State. That is far below what we owe our children, and we ought to be open to different ways to educate children, and that is what we're supposed to, our country supposedly stands for diversity of thought and diversity of background, diversity of peoples. Well, diversity of approaches in public education have been fought tooth and nail by the establishment, the established order. So, it's a question of directing, information to the people about how much money is in the schools. That is the biggest myth that is so pernicious and promulgated by the schools district. The school systems, everyone that speaks about public education that works in the public system says that the schools are underfunded. Not one of them ever says, thank you for all the money you've given us. We have a lot more money than we had before. You never hear that. You never hear that. They are, and that's what's so discouraging, that the people that are educated, the administrators that are running our schools have recognized that they cannot tell the truth about school funding. They must tell lies because they must get more money next year.
Well, let me play devil's advocate here and say, okay, well, let's say I'm a school district supervisor, And I've I've looked at this. I've got a big increase in funding. Sure, I'll grant you that. But I'll use an analogy. I'll say it's like having a car repaired. Let's say, I find out my car needs $10,000 worth of repairs. And yes, I've got more than $5,000 this year. I've got $9,000. But I still need that extra $1,000 to get the car to work. So the reason why it's not working yet is because I'm just short of the tipping point that will get things moving again. What about that kind of an argument?
Well, the argument may be true for a car, but when you're talking about public education, which is a very personal effort between the transfer of knowledge from a teacher to a child, is a very interpersonal and tricky thing.
It's an
because
intimate
it's
thing.
intimate
Yeah.
because it depends on what the child is bringing to the table. It depends on what the teacher brings to the table. It depends on what the family is doing. It depends on the leadership of the school, and so it's very interesting to watch this, because you can see that schools that have strong leaders, the principals that are supporting the teachers, and backing teachers from unfair attacks from parents. Sometimes that happens. And backing teachers for imposing high, rigorous standards for grading. If you have a principal that is doing that, and you have families that are supporting the child, you're going to get excellence in education. But what's happened in public education is we've moved so far away from that. The principals are no longer the disciplinarians of the teachers. Teachers have tenure. They cannot be fired. The principals no longer select the team in the school. So you can have a principal who's very determined to do great work with children, and he can have a third of his staff that is disaffected, not working hard, and he can't work then hard to create this culture. It's the culture of the school that is so critical to the success of the children, and that is what is undermined by this bureaucratic, top-down, union-driven system, So it doesn't matter how much money you give such a system, because if you can't remove the bad teacher from a classroom, if you can't remove a bad principal from the leadership of a school, you are always going to have an underperforming system. It doesn't matter how much money you give it. It's a waste of extra money to give a system like that more money. In fact, if we were giving, I think you could make an argument that if you give the system less, you would see the central bureaucrats who are consuming so much of the money away from the classroom forced to cut staff in the central bureaucracy to drive funding to the schools, forced to stop trying to regulate the schools from afar, forced by virtue of lack of money for the central bureaucrat to allow the teachers to teach and the principals to lead. You could make that argument. I'm not going to make that argument. I think schools should be, funded fairly, and obviously costs go up every year by inflation, and we have to fund the schools fairly. I'm not making that argument, but I do think the way we're funding the schools is leading to is undercutting quality and excellence.
Do you think it's more of a mindset where our focus has been on the funding of schools, as you put it, fairly, instead of, say, the funding of a student's education fairly?
Yes.
You know what I mean? Where
Yes.
the focus is on what does the student need, not what does this particular school need or the system.
Yeah.
What does the student need?
The system, exactly.
Yeah.
That's a great point. And that is why these programs to provide scholarships directly to the family, directing aid to families so they can decide how to spend the money, shifts the focus to what the child needs. And that's, of course, what the family is best positioned to decide, not some bureaucrat that's sitting many desks away from the child, and the family doesn't know anything about them. No, it's true. The system, do we fund the system or do we fund the child? And I think, obviously, every rational person would say, let's fund the child. Let's shift. And it's all about a power and control over the funding. Right now, the people who have the most power are the ones sitting on education committees in the legislature, superintendents of public instruction, superintendents in local school districts, the ones who allocate the funding, instead of the principals. instead of the principal of the school, who should be able to decide, I need extra counselors in this school, or I need extra social workers in this school, or extra teachers. I have too few teachers. But no, he can't decide that.
We're just about done. We've gone a bit over, but I had one more question for you, which it just came to me as you were talking about how we've doubled education spending overall. The per pupil spending's gone up by 60 some odd percent.
Yes.
Sounds like. And this was one of the big calls for the education unions, the government unions, and for the establishment kind of systemic bureaucracy, and a lot of elected officials. How many of them are now saying, "Look, it's clear we're fully funded now. We've got to deal with other systemic reforms in order to get things working." How often do you hear someone concede a point now and say, "Yeah, we're fully funded"?
Well, that's the biggest disappointment I've had. I don't hear anybody saying that on either side of the aisle. I don't see anyone really concerned about this. I mean, we are spending over 50% of Washington State's budget on the schools, K-12 schools, and we're getting very mediocre results. And if we supposedly care about our students, someone should be yelling and screaming about this. Instead, all we hear is we need more money. If that isn't a basic failure of our system, I don't know what is. And really, it underscores the need for moving money to the power of the parents, away from the legislatures, the districts, this huge establishment, the education establishment we call around here. It's an establishment. It's a powerful, politically powerful entity that refuses to change, refuses to improve, and demands more money from the populace.
And nobody's going to care more about one child's education than the parent of that child.
Exactly.
The caretaker of that child.
You need to give those families power to direct the education of children. And in Washington State, we'll see how long that will take, but it's happening in other states. Other states are giving parents direct scholarships so they can send their special needs child to a specialized school that can serve his or her needs perfectly and help them get over dyslexia or autism or whatever it is that is their problem. There are schools, there are states across the nation that are expanding charter schools. There are states that are helping families with direct grants so they can look around them and see what they can do to help their children. Arizona and Florida are particularly forward-leaning. Those legislatures there seem to see themselves as assistance to the families and not to the powerful entities in the schools. It's very interesting.
Well, I'm looking forward to the new report coming out from you, the report on school spending. Mm-hmm. We should see that probably the early part of the new year, I'm guessing. Is that about right?
Yes. I did a review of the 20 largest school districts' spending and student learning results in Washington State, covering about 40% of the students in Washington State, and showing the increase in spending that they have received in each district, how much money on average their teachers receive, and what results they're getting for that money. I'm
sure every district you covered is dying for a copy of that report so they can go through it and make the changes needed.
Well, I would, if I were a district superintendent, I'd be embarrassed that here in Seattle, for example, where the Seattle Public Schools is now spending over $1 billion in its budget. It's $19,700 per student in Seattle. And why is it then that in the Seattle area, there are the 30% of the children are attending private schools, when the local public schools are so well funded? Why is it that well-funded families are not choosing to enroll their children in those schools, in the Seattle schools? It's really an embarrassing situation for the local district.
Amazing. And I'm guessing that we'll be speaking again on this podcast coming up early in the new year. Liv Finne, Washington Policy Center Director of Education. This is David Bose, the Communications Director for Washington Policy Center. You've been listening to Washington Policy on the Go. Hope you'll tune in for the next episode next week. And I think that's going to be a YP edition. YP usually does the first podcast for the first week of the month, but they got into some conflicts of scheduling, so it's Liv and I today. Thanks so much for listening, and tune in again.
Thanks for listening to Washington Policy on the Go. If you liked it, tell a friend and share this episode on your social media. Send any questions or comments to us at washingtonpolicy@washingtonpolicy.org.